So just a small bit of background about myself. So during the day, I'm a web developer and software developer for the University of Kent, but my main job is working on something called Games That Weren't, which is a digital archive dedicated to unreleased and cancelled video games. I also cover prototypes, so of released games with like differences and features that never got actually shown in the final game. And we also kind of feature games which we're not quite sure if they were released or not. They may have just been sold in very limited numbers, but they haven't yet been preserved. So we try and do a search for those as well. So at the moment, we cover a whole range of different systems from the Commodore 64 right up to modern day. And we have over 3,500 entries overall. So yeah, there's basically a whole plethora of reasons why games get cancelled. And I mean, it could be something as simple as a company going bust. It could be that a game is too ambitious, the hardware failed. It could be something as simple that the developer got bored and they just decided to go on to something completely different. And there's so many different stories out there. And some of those we'll see today and discover as we go through. So back in 1990, I was like a typical gaming kid. I got a Commodore 64 and I've got hair as well, so there's the evidence. And I absolutely fell in love with that machine. And I really got into magazines in particular. So I used to run down the newsagent at 6:30 in the morning just to try and get the latest issue of Commodore format and see what was on the cover tape. But gradually, the Commodore 64 started to commercially decline. So what happened was a lot of the companies started to move on to different platforms and like the Sega Mega Drive and the SNES and so on. So we started to see companies stop doing games for the C64. So the magazines had less to cover overall. And what we started to see was like retrospectives like we can see here, where this was quite good because it allowed me to discover games in a pre-internet time. But what they were doing is they were trying to essentially fill up the content for the magazine so they had something to sell. But it was one particular issue in May 1993 which would really captivate me and capture my imagination and would set me on a trajectory which I could never have imagined and which has led me to standing here today. And it was this particular article, something called That Was the Game That Wasn't, written by a chap called Ian Osborne. And this was another retrospective to fill up the magazines. But the big difference was that there was no actual kind of ratings in there. And the reason why is because they weren't finished. They were cancelled at various stages and never saw the light of day. And I was just absolutely mesmerised by this article. For a start, I was also really sad that there was these wonderful looking games shown in these screenshots, but I wasn't able to play them. And because of that, it made my desire even stronger to actually like find them and play them for myself. But the other thing as well, there was these detailed screenshots being shown in the magazine. So I was thinking to myself, well, surely the magazines must have got hold of these games. So maybe there's a chance that I could get hold of them too and play them. And there was one particular game that really stood out for me at the time. And it was this game called The Great Guiana Sisters. I was a massive fan of Super Mario Brothers, like many people back in the day. And I was desperate for someone to do a conversion to the Commodore 64. And they showcased this game. So straight away it stood out to me. But the other thing that really stood out was the fact that it was actually released. And it was released for a very short period of time. And I've noticed that Neil's got a copy actually in the archive just here, so I might steal it later when he's not looking. But this meant there was an actual chance to go out there and find this game, to actually try and go to the boot fairs and all of the second-hand shops. And that's exactly what I did. I started to trawl for it for about a year trying to find it, but to no avail. And what I particularly love about this, so this game, as you can clearly see, Great Guiana Sisters, which is obvious where that's come from, they put a little trademark on there. You know, because obviously you don't really want anyone infringing your copyright or anything like that. So this was out there and I didn't have much luck finding it at all. Around about the same time, I was a regular visitor to a computer shop in Canterbury called Computer World. And I used to absolutely adore this shop. It had Amiga stuff and Commodore 64 bits in there. And through a friend, I learned that there was a long blonde-haired chap in there called Jason, who was a massive Commodore 64 nut like myself. And I'd never really met anyone else like that who had the same interests. Everyone had moved on to the Mega Drive and that kind of thing. And I was really excited to meet him. And that chap was Jason Kelk, who became a really good friend of mine. Now, many of you might remember Jason as the person who wrote the homebrew column in Retro Gamer. But I started asking about the unreleased games in that article that sort of captivated me a year before. And to my astonishment, he said that he had many of those games in his collection. What I didn't realise, there was this sort of underground cracking scene where people were kind of leaking games and spreading them amongst one another. So very kindly, he made up some discs for me and sent them in the post. And I was absolutely blown away by this. This is just a couple of examples of some of those discs he sent. And on one of the discs, there's 3 games, Wildfire, Alloy Run, and Judge Anderson, which were 3 of the games that were shown in that article. So what happened was, we ended up with a situation where these screenshots that I've been poring over for over a year would suddenly come to life, and I was now actually physically playing them. And it was a really magical moment for me. I was actually playing these games that I wasn't meant to play. It was almost something kind of taboo. It was almost like these should have been supplied to me in a brown paper bag or something off a top shelf. I just got really addicted to it, and I was kind of amazed I was being able to play these games that I shouldn't have. So I kind of wanted more.
Hey you, do you want something rare and unreleased? Go to PCBWay.com, click on Shared Projects, type in the secret word Neptune, and you can order a PCB for the unreleased Sega Neptune. And you can buy a beautifully crafted case for it all to go inside. All made by those clever people at PCBWay.com. PCBWay.com. Have it your way.
But you did manage to track down that elusive boxed copy of Guiana Sisters, though, didn't you, Frank? Tell us about how you found it.
So it was it must have been about 1997, so a couple of years after spotted in the article and after I was doing the search. And he used to go to these boot fairs with my dad, like every Sunday. He used to get up really early to go to them. And there was one particular boot fair where we were sort of walking along, and just there was this sort of largish box, and it had like a Commodore 16 black tape deck sticking out of it, and that just drew me in straight away. And it had £5 on the box as well, and I was thinking, oh great. So I wandered over to have a look, and I realised that under the tape deck it was basically Commodore 64 games. So I was like, okay, great, it's even better. So I started going through, and I just had this really random, strange feeling, like almost like a sixth sense, like that Guiana Sisters was going to be in there. I don't know why. I've only had this happen like a few times in my life. But I went about 2 cassettes down, and lo and behold, there it was. And I just could not believe it. Just at this random boot fair in Dover, there it was.
Have you had similar luck with any other games at car boot sales like that?
No, nothing that can top that, really. I mean, yeah, maybe like some boxed rare consoles, like a Dragon 32 that's boxed and that kind of thing, but nothing to that scale. So, yeah, I think that was the pinnacle.
So I started to dig through all the various magazines that I had and just see if there was others that I could find out about, to see if I could find more information or other titles that I could start searching for. And I was absolutely blown away by just the amount that was in there. So there's various previews which never saw full review, games that just disappeared after a first mention. So Ian had only merely scratched the surface with his article. So I started sort of collating this notebook and having all these details together, and most of the time I was just asking Jason if he had copies of them and other people, and starting to build this little collection together. But around about that same time, the Commodore 64 sort of finally died out. The magazine stopped, and what we had to do was the ones who remained on the platform had to come up with their own fanzines to try and keep the machine alive. And this is one of the magazines that Jason and another chap called Jason McKenzie started creating, called Commodore Zone. It ran for about 6 years, and there was basically a couple of issues released every year. And I used to do little reviews for this as well. I wanted to contribute and always wanted to be a writer after the fascination with magazines. And this was a really grainy photo from around that time when I was doing that. So this is the Commodore 64 setup I had. That I used to write my articles on, really shoddily written 14-year-old articles. And yeah, and there's the phone that I used to ring Jason up with all my inane questions all the time. And I think my mum might even still have the pudding bowl in her kitchen, so if anyone needs a haircut, then you just ask my mum. But basically, I wanted to do something regular, like a regular feature for the magazine, and I wasn't quite sure what to do. And Jason just turned around and said, well, you bloody keep going on about unreleased games. Why don't you just do a feature on that? And it was like a light bulb moment. And I thought, well, why don't I just do a continuation of Ian's article? And that's exactly what I did. And this was when Games That Weren't was born for the very first time. So I did a series of these poorly written articles for about 6 issues overall. And one of the first big surprises with it is that I started to get people getting in touch, writing letters and suggesting other games to cover. But they were also getting in touch, talking about the games that we covered to give more information. So this notebook that I had was just growing and growing and growing, but I had no outlet at all to actually share that information with anyone. I only had this article, and what I had was outgrowing that. But thankfully, there was like a huge technological advance that was happening, and that was the internet. So what happened was, around about the late 90s, I got hold of a PC for the first time, a dial-up modem, and a little bit of web space with FreeServe, and started to knock about creating my own HTML web pages. And one of the first things I did was this little kind of miniature archive where you could click on an A to Z, and you could download just various previews I'd managed to collate from over the last couple of years. It was meant to be an extension just of the article, and that was it. But soon enough, I started to extend it and started adding pages with most of the content from the article, but also other content that we found and which was collated in that notebook. And that was a good reason. The good reason for doing that was so we could actually share games that didn't have a download that we were potentially looking for. And what happened was, after these pages were kind of put online, all of a sudden, I had loads of people getting in touch via email with lots of other suggestions of other games to cover and feature, other games that were already out there in some shape or form, but which I wasn't aware of. They also got in touch about pre-existing things that we were covering with further information and scans. Another additional surprise was we had actual developers for some of those games getting in touch and sharing their stories too. So the archive just suddenly exploded and just started to grow quite heavily. I started to have to update quite frequently. So I mentioned just briefly that there was a huge trust thing at the beginning when we were starting out, and no one really knew who we were, and we were just kind of a website essentially. But what happened was we had a couple of pivotal moments very early on, which I think were the turning points, which really put us on the map and started to get people believing in what we were doing, that we were a real deal and we weren't trying to rip them off. And one of the first ones was related to the game that was in Ian's original article. So this was a game called Deadlock, which was due for release by System 3 back in the early 90s. And it was done by a development team called Cyberdyne Systems, which has nothing to do with Terminator 2, but it was just people who obviously loved the film. So it was Dan Phillips, it was the coder, and you had Robin Levy, famous artist, was the graphic artist for it as well. And they were working on this game for a number of years, but then it just suddenly disappeared, and we didn't know much about it. So we just had a basic page on the web page, essentially saying what Ian had originally written. And then all of a sudden, Dan got in touch out of the blue. And he was in the process of backing all of his work disks up in the exact same way I was doing. So he got the same equipment. And he said that once he'd sorted everything out, he would actually produce a couple of working builds that we could put on the website. And true to his word, after about a year, that static screenshot that we'd all been poring over suddenly came to life. And we were able to see that game in a playable state. And this caused quite a ripple on the 64 scene, because this was a game that not just only I was looking for, but lots of others remembered reading in the likes of Zap64 and got really excited about. But the additional side effect of this was that something I wasn't expecting, is that both Rob and Dan gave a very detailed and quite brutal account of the game. They kind of felt that they spent too much time on the design and the graphics, but not enough time on the playability, and that's essentially why it got canned. But it was such an honest account, and I wasn't expecting that, and it gave a real detailed insight that I think people appreciated. And other developers saw this too, and that allowed them to kind of open up as well for other games.
When you talk about preserving the games, is it just the games themselves on the games that weren't archived, or does it go beyond that with other materials too?
So it all depends on what's available. We try and preserve everything. So even if it's just a simple sprite, I mean, sometimes people will say, why do you bother going to that degree? But we're trying to preserve everything really. And I'm kind of someone who likes to hoard to a degree every bit of history that I can. So it doesn't matter if it's something as small as a sprite, we'll put it on the site. So we'll put scans, like interviews from old magazines, or just text interviews, like modern day ones in text from people, like a Q&A and that kind of thing. But yeah, it could be things like just the music or art assets that are taken from games. Doesn't necessarily have to be something that's playable.
Do you have any favourite items in your archive that aren't actually a game?
Well, I guess one of my favourite one of my favourite collections in the archive has to be for like Charlie Chaplin. I mean, we have the game. We're very lucky to have the game preserved, but the Atari ST version's missing. We just have the Commodore 64 edition. But the developer who made it, he very kindly sort of got in touch and turned up to one of these retro events in Blackpool with like a massive cardboard box full of all this paperwork. And it was with these like all these technical drawings for the game, like for the sprites and all of the background assets. And it was just a whole stack of it that I just scanned in and just made available on the website as a gallery. So that was really cool. And I like a lot of those entries where we're able to kind of get that additional information as well as just like source code and something to download and the odd magazine scan. When someone's a bit of a hoarder and they've kept all of those design documents, that's like a lovely bonus to have. It kind of tells a lot more about the game and what the process was for developing it. And often there's bits of information in there which developers forgot as well. So it kind of helps to fill in the gaps when you're trying to tell the story. And also sometimes the thing that makes me laugh in particular is when you go through the code and they've kind of written comments in the code and they've sworn and said F this and F that because they've got a particular bug in there that they're trying to fix. And I think that was something in particular we found with Archer McLean's materials when we were scanning all of his code in. He was just berating himself constantly in his code, and I kind of really loved that.
For the next pivotal moment, can anyone tell me what could possibly connect an old briefcase and a rusty old radiator?
Were you chained to both of them?
I can't possibly comment. I've told you not to mention that, Paul. No, you look all completely bemused. Okay, well, what you might find is in an actual briefcase, you might find an unreleased game, and in that briefcase, tucked away, you might find that shoved behind an old radiator. And that's exactly what happened with our next game, Solar Jetman on the Commodore 64. A really bizarre story. So Solar Jetman was a very popular game on the NES, rock hard. It was a sort of a Gravitar and Thrust clone with some really lovely graphics. And a company called the Sales Curve were going to do conversions for all the home computers at the time. So they were getting software creations to do all the conversions, but that's all we knew. There was only a couple of news snippets in the magazine at the time saying about it. There was no screenshots that we were aware of. There were ZX Spectrum screenshots, but we weren't aware of them at that time. So we assumed it was vaporware and nothing existed. And then we put that on the website, and then suddenly one of the artists, Hayden Dalton, got in touch out of the blue and just said, oh yeah, I'm the artist and I did all of the graphics for all of the versions and it was complete. So we were just completely blown away. Then we got in touch with the developer, and unfortunately both of them had nothing of the game at all. So we're thinking, right, there's going to be not much chance of finding this. And then suddenly, after about 8 months, Hayden started kind of digging through his garage because he was getting ready to move to America, and shoved behind an old radiator, he found a briefcase. Inside, there was a load of like 1991 gaming merch because he went to a computer show, and in the middle was just a couple of discs labelled Commodore 64 Solar Jetman. So he very kindly sent these discs to us in the post as quick as possible, but we had no idea what was on, and we didn't know if it was just his graphics or something very early, we weren't sure. But upon loading up, we were absolutely blown away to see that it was actually the full game on the Commodore 64, featuring some wonderful music by the late Jeff Folin. And everyone, when we put this on the website, this caused waves yet again, but mainly because no one had ever seen it in action. There was no screenshots. They weren't expecting to see a full conversion. It was beyond anything that anyone had expected. And because the developers had got in touch to share these materials, that also increased confidence in us as a website to kind of, for other developers to get in touch and to share their materials. I just wanted to highlight a couple in particular that I got particularly fond memories of for various different reasons, and I'll kind of be as brief as I can. The first one is a game called Oops, which was like a 1970s arcade game being done by Larry Rosenthal. And it was a very controversial game because the main aim of the game is you had 2 players. One player would control a swarm of sperm that had to fertilise an egg in the middle of the screen. You then had a second player which had a syringe that sprayed sort of fertilising foam trying to kill the sperm. Now the idea is that if the sperm managed to fertilise the egg to 100%, you'd get the word oops appear on the screen. So it was a perfect game to cover, but so it tested really badly, so people didn't quite like the idea. Yeah, it was strange, really strange. I mean, at one point, apparently there was a story where the secretary came in and like ran out screaming, saying, "Oh my God, there's sperm on the screen," and yeah, so it didn't do very well. And Larry ended up leaving Vectorbeam, and then his colleague Dan Sunday, and this is the part that I really enjoyed. One of the findings was that Dan Sunday, his colleague, came in and tried to resurrect the idea. So what he did was that he decided to try and improve the game. He fixed the syringe in the center of the screen. So it was fixed inside the egg and rotated, but then he put also these rotating box shields around the syringe. And the improvements made the game better, but still the concept just wasn't working. So eventually it was dropped. But just before it was fully dropped, a chap called Tim Skelly at Cinematronics, he happened to see that prototype with those changes, and he loved the idea of the ship being fixed in the middle with the rotating shields. So when he went back to Cinematronics, he needed an idea for a brand new arcade game to design to give to one of his developers, and he came up with the idea of Star Castle, which is a very famous arcade. And this was the very first time we got to learn about the origins of Star Castle. And again, this was something that was unexpected. I wasn't expecting to find that out, and I was really happy to kind of share that with people.
I think lots of people will be interested in this. So tell us about how you capture the data from the old media, and have your methods changed over the years in how you do that?
So when I first started out, we didn't know really how to transfer anything at all. It was all kind of new ground. So luckily, someone had already figured it out. So there was a guy in Hungary by the name of STA, stat.org or something, I think his website was. And it's a guy from Hungary. And he built these XE1541 cables, custom built. So it connects to your parallel port, and the other end would plug into your Commodore 64 disk drive. And that's essentially what I used to preserve all of like my Commodore 64 and VIC-20 materials back in the early days. So as well as unreleased games, I also sort of helped preserve like just general release stuff for some of the archives like GameBase 64 and GameBase VIC-20. But this cable, in addition to disk, you could also plug it into your Commodore 64 and you could back up tapes as well. That was the great bonus with it. So I used that for many, many years. But I'd say it's definitely evolved as the years have gone on. We're very lucky to have a lot of different technologies coming out now. So thanks to things like Raspberry Pis and the ability for people to create their own PCBs a lot easier these days. We've got quite a number of devices on the market. So one of the new ones I use quite a lot now is something called a Kyroflux, which is just a tiny PCB which looks like a Arduino essentially, and it's got like a connection for connecting up a PC floppy drive or 3.5 inch, 5.25, and also Spectrum 3-inch discs if you really want to. The good thing about that is that can back up any format. It doesn't matter what the disk is. It will just back up a raw level format, and then you can worry about trying to convert it into a format to run in an emulator. The main thing is getting the raw data backed up. So you have that data there, and then you can do what you like with it and try and figure that bit out. So that's been a really useful tool, especially like now we cover a lot of different systems as well as the C64. And then on the Commodore 64 side, I use something called the 1541 Ultimate 2, which is like a cartridge that plugs in the back. And that's a really, really lovely device overall. And I kind of I don't know where I'd be without that now. And essentially what that does, that creates like a virtual disk drive. So it's got an SD card in it, and you can set up virtual drives in it, and you can plug then a standard disk drive into the Commodore as well, like doing the old daisy chaining effect like you used to do. And all I do is I set one device as device 8, which might be the virtual drive, and the other device is device 9, and I just simply do a disk copy using standard copying software, and that works fine as well for unprotected stuff. If it's protected, then I have to go through the Kyroflux route and do a proper conversion that way. And then tapes, I use a special device called a DC2M, which is a custom device built by a chap called Luigi De Freya. And this is something that's evolved over the years. This just allows me to plug a tape deck in and has an SD card, and it just reads out the tapes directly to a tape image. If I'm doing Spectrum things, I just use a standard audio cassette tape deck hooked up with a audio cable to a PC.
So just really quickly, over the years, there's been a lot of recoveries on the website. 25 years is a long time, and there's far too many to talk about here, and we would be here for maybe a couple of weeks. So I've just pulled out 8 fairly significant ones that I think are quite important. You might disagree with some of them if you've used the site before. The first one is a game called Tiger Tiger. So this was a game that was being done by Firebird during the late 80s. It was a clone of Black Tiger, a Capcom arcade game. This was being done by Gary Liddon of Zap 64 fame, and also had graphics by Paul Doherty, who's been working with Jeff on the new documentary for The Heart of Neon. So this was the game they were working on together. Unfortunately, Gary used to keep getting distracted with different things. I think Rainbow Islands came into the office at the time, and that distracted him quite a lot. So unfortunately, it got cancelled early on when Firebird transitioned over to Microprose. Luckily, Gary had kept all of his source code and passed that on to Jason Kelk, who then subsequently passed it to us. And then this was 2 guys called Henrik and Janny, very carefully and meticulously took apart all of the source code in a PDS, Programmers Development System format, and pieced it together in what they described as like a 100,000 piece jigsaw. So it took them months to get all of it working. So we ended up with this prototype here. And it's not fully playable. There's a couple of enemies knocking about, but you can explore the different levels, and it's a nice glimpse of this game that kind of haunted many gamers back in the day from the adverts. And then possibly the biggest game overall that we've ever recovered, and this was one of our holy grails, Daffy Duck on the Commodore 64. Let's turn that down a little bit. So this was a game that I'd read about in the magazines back in the day. So we had a full review, but unfortunately High-Tech went bust literally weeks after that review was published. So the game didn't get to a mastering stage. So this started our search on the website, and it was a search that lasted 18 years overall. We got in touch with people from High-Tech. They no longer had anything of the game. And also the developers and the artists no longer had anything either. Also they thought. So we kind of went on for years trying to find something with no joy. We even had people creating hoaxes, saying they had the game, putting fake screenshots on the websites and stuff. And then when it came to doing the book, I decided to do a multi-format write-up of Daffy Duck, covering the Spectrum and the Amiga and the ST versions as well. And it was whilst doing that, I got back in touch with the artist, and he suddenly just said, "Oh yeah, I've just found all my box of discs in the attic," just out of nowhere. So I suddenly crapped myself, literally. Well, I think I did. And then just went all the way up to Leamington Spa to pick up those box of discs that you saw in one of the earlier photos, and sort of rushed back to get them. He was convinced the game wouldn't be on there. He was the artist and felt that he wouldn't have had a copy of the game. But what he'd forgotten was that his developer colleague had given him a disc box full of PC discs with a complete backup of all of his source code, which included Daffy Duck. So we got to work meticulously putting together, and Martin Pugh did a fantastic job piecing this together so we had the full game. And finally an 18-year search come to an end, and yeah, this caused quite big waves in the scene at the time. Now for us, the reason I've included this one is just because it came from nowhere really. We didn't really know it existed. I just heard a rumour that there was a PC edition of this game that was produced quite late on in Firebird's life. And we were told that it was developed by a team called Walk in Circles. So did a bit of digging, and I found the programmer was a guy called Lee Smithies, and I found him quite easily on LinkedIn, got in touch, and he was extremely helpful, and turned around and said, "Oh yeah, I've got my disc just sitting on the shelf just next to me." Just randomly, he must have been waiting. So one weekend, he backed everything up, and then all of a sudden I had a working image that I could run in DOSBox for the first time. So this was quite a nice surprise to have and stick on the website. The next game, it looks like just a standard conversion of the Defender and Stargate, but there's actually a bigger story behind this, which is really quite special. And this came as a result of preserving all of Archer McLean's work discs. And as we were going through, I noticed that there were a couple of prototypes or bits of code for a Defender and also a Stargate development done by Archer. Now, many of you know that Archer went on to do Drop Zone, a fantastic sort of Defender-style game, which is great in its own right. Now, the problem was, back in the day, in many interviews, Archer had kind of told people that he was heavily inspired by Defender and Stargate, but what we didn't know is that he actually started proper conversions that he actually pitched to Atari. So he started off doing Defender back in 1982, took it to Atari, a really good prototype, and Atari just rejected it straight away. They weren't interested, and I don't understand why. But undeterred, he then went back to it again, and when Stargate came out, he decided to improve his code and make Stargate. He went back to Atari. This time they were very excited, but they already had someone assigned to do the conversion. So again, he got rejected. But what it meant was he got so frustrated with that he just decided to make his own game. And that's why Drop Zone was born for the first time. And it's thanks to Atari that we're able to see Drop Zone. If they had signed him up, we may never have seen it. I don't know. So these prototypes you can download for yourself and check out on the website. This game was the first ever PlayStation game, PlayStation 2 game that we had to reserve. And this came as a result of doing the book through different contacts. So there was another chap called Stuart Main, who was a level designer at Acclaim Cheltenham at the time. And he'd done another book for Bitmap Books. And we were going to a 10th anniversary party. And he said, "Oh, I've got a couple of prototypes. Would you like to sort of back them up and put them on the website?" And one of them was The Last Job. And this got cancelled when Acclaim closed its doors back in the early 2000s. And this was quite a challenge because I'd never done PlayStation discs before and had to find the right kind of drive to read the discs and the right materials to back it up. It's quite a special prototype because they've got a new feature in there called Parallel Play, where the idea is that you've got these 4 different characters all playing at the exact same time, but you played them in sequence. So we had one character and you had to kind of break into a safe or do something. But if you didn't do it very well and didn't do it in a fast enough time, it would have a roll-on effect for the next person doing their task and make your task much harder. So it was quite a neat little feature. So there wasn't really anything about this on the website at all. There was a couple of news items, but nothing of great detail. So this surprised quite a lot of people when it was released last year. The next game is a bit of a cheat. It's not technically an unreleased game, but it's got such a cool story behind it that I had to kind of share it with you. So Monster Muncher was this Pac-Man clone, which was done by Matthew Smith. It was a very rare excursion onto a different platform, and he wrote this on the Commodore VIC-20. So in a couple of interviews, Matthew had mentioned that he'd done a Pac-Man clone in the space of an afternoon, and he'd done it as a favour for a friend who was doing another conversion, a rip-off of a Defender game, and it was for a company that basically would turn into Ocean. So after a bit of digging, the company that turned into Ocean was Spectrum Games, and then sure enough we found out the game was Monster Muncher, but the game had only been seemingly released on the ZX Spectrum. There was no sign of a VIC-20 version. So we began a search which would last for possibly about 10 years, and it was looking like nothing was being found. We didn't think that Matthew had anything in the game any longer. And then all of a sudden an eBay auction came up last year. So we tried to bid for it and we were unlucky. And then we tried to get in touch with the person who bought it, but we had nothing back from them at all. So we're thinking that this is going to remain lost still. Then literally about a month later, I visited the Retro Computer Museum in Leicester. I was taken there and they've got this whole little VIC-20 section. And I was kind of having a little browse through, just seeing if there was any games that hadn't been yet preserved. And I was talking to my friends and I was telling them the story about this game and how we missed out on the auction. And I was just kind of flicking through and joking, saying, "Oh, wouldn't it be amazing if Monster Muncher was in here?" And I started going through, and then behind just one layer, there it was, staring me in the face. And I pick up this copy and I'm like shaking like that, going, "Oh my God." And then they're just kind of going, "Oh my God," as well. And then Andy, who runs the museum, he was going, "Oh my God." Because he was a massive Matthew Smith nut. He had a whole shrine dedicated to him in the museum, and he didn't realise he had one of his lost games. Just sat there all along. So yeah, this is also on the website, and someone's actually tidied up some of the bugs that Matt kind of left in there, which is understandable because he only knocked this out in about 3 hours apparently, but I'm not sure of that. The Bubbler I've included because this was a conversion of the Ultimate Play the Game on the Spectrum. This was a title that we didn't know anything about. We never knew it existed. There was nothing in the magazines at the time to say that a conversion was underway. I only knew about it thanks to Jason, whose friend worked at a company called Linsoft, where they did a number of conversions. They even worked on an early version of International Karate that got cancelled. So he was tasked with doing a conversion of the Spectrum game, but Ultimate had this ridiculous requirement that you had to recreate the exact same drawing routine as on the ZX Spectrum, which ran at a much faster speed as the 64. So unsurprisingly, when he finished the game, it started to run like he was wading through treacle. And as a result, Ultimate weren't happy and the game was cancelled. So thankfully, Matt had all of his discs. He very kindly passed them all on to us and we preserved them. And Matt, along with another chap, so Janny, who worked on Tiger, carefully pieced it together. And now you can play the full game for yourself. But if you do, I highly recommend you speed it up in an emulator because it is very slow. And then finally was one of the first SNES games that we had to preserve back when we were doing the book. And this is a later version of Green Lantern, so quite a highly sought after game on the SNES. So whilst we were doing the book and I was investigating doing the game, one of the artists turned around and said they had a prototype cartridge and could we try and back it up? So we had a go, got a device that allowed us to back up the ROM, and this is what we found. And it's just a really early preview, which was built on top of the Jurassic Park 2 engine. So it's just a really simple platformer. There's even bits of Jurassic Park 2 still stuck in there. But this was quite really cool to find, so we could actually put screenshots in the book. But there's a much bigger story to this, which I'll come on to a little bit later.
You've got lots of exciting finds coming your way now, Frank. You've been doing this for over 25 years, but after the first 20 years, you decided to write this very weighty book. Tell us all about it.
Okay, so the book was a strange thing, really. I was at a point where I was coming up to like my mid-30s, and I also work in like an industry where the stuff you produce is quite volatile. You produce a piece of software or a website, and it might sort of stay there for maybe a couple of years, maybe a bit longer if you're lucky, and then it kind of gets chucked away. And that kind of a lot of my work felt like it was being chucked away quite periodically. So, and even the website that we were doing for games that weren't, I mean, once I go, that might disappear potentially. Maybe not so much because of archive.org and things like that, but I kind of basically wanted to produce something physical, almost like I was here sort of marker. And it felt like the book was the perfect way to do that. And originally it wasn't going to tie into the 20th anniversary because I was quite a way away from that. Originally I just started off thinking I was going to do a very small book that kind of covered a couple of games on the website. And I thought I could knock this book out in about a year and then I could scratch that itch and it was done. But very early on, I kind of felt that it was people paying money for a book. They were kind of, if they were getting something they could just read on the website, it wasn't really value for money. So I really wanted to make sure that if I produced something that people were going to pay money for, it was going to be something fresh and like really good, or that's what I was hoping. So I started to cover, first of all, different formats, multiple formats, but then also started to kind of get more information from people about the games we were covering. In addition to that, I wanted to cover games that we weren't necessarily covering on the website. I wanted to cover things that hadn't really been covered before. But if we did cover something on the website, I wanted it to be in much, much more detail than we'd done on the website. And that's kind of the approach I took. But unfortunately, I sort of heavily underestimated how long that was going to take. It was no longer going to take a year. And suddenly about 3 or 4 years in, I was thinking, I'm never going to finish this thing. And it grew into a complete and utter monster. So a really lovely surprise last year was when I got the new Zap annual. So they do the Zap annuals every year, and a chap, Ian Osborne, who wrote the original article, does regular contributions for the annual, which is quite nice. But I picked it up, and he never said a word to me at all. I was flicking through, and there was a whole article talking about games that weren't, but how his article had inspired it all as well. And I thought that was really lovely. I was completely blown away. Just how full circle things had gone overall. I wasn't expecting it, and it was just a lovely way to kind of go full circle and see him being really happy about how we've taken his original article and how it kind of grew into something quite beautiful.
Unfortunately, as well as the many recoveries, there are also many games that have so far eluded us that we're still searching for today and trying to find. But only for now. Hopefully we'll never give up hope and we'll keep searching for many of these titles. And here's just a few examples of those. The big one is our second sort of Holy Grail title. So we've got Daffy Duck, but this is the other one that still eludes us and haunts me in my dreams. This was an isometric sort of Cluedo game, and it was released for the likes of the Amiga, the ST and the PC. And the Commodore 64 came a bit later. It was reviewed in all the magazines, but inexplicably US Gold just didn't release it. We don't know why. We still don't know why to this day. What we think happened was that the 16-bit versions didn't sell well at all, so they just decided to jettison it, which is something that US Gold commonly did. Now, the other thing as well is that the game was only listed as being available on disc, so that could have been another reason that discs didn't sell as well as tapes. But the programmer, when we got in touch with him, turned around and said that the game was a single load anyway. They could have easily put this on tape. So to this day, we don't know. Unfortunately, the coder has nothing of the game. No one from US Gold that we contacted. I mean, we contacted as many people as we possibly could find, even people who reviewed the game in the magazine. No one has it. So this might be one that escapes us. I don't know, but we never give up, and we'll always keep searching until my dying days. Then, of course, Mire is a very well-known unreleased game on the ZX Spectrum. So this is one we haven't done like a full in-depth search. Many others have done, and we've tried to help out where we can. This is one where there's not much known about it at all. There's been various little clues released at the end of the other Ultimate games. And over the years, little bits have been snuck out. So this cover artwork was snuck out from the Rare archives. And some of the developers have given their insights. People that worked at Rare asked the stampers what was the game about and got little snippets of information. But unfortunately, there's nothing of the game itself. There's a rumour that not much actually got started at all. And it was going to be some kind of a Sabrewolf style game with a 2.5D viewpoint. And from those recollections, someone actually made their own version of the game, how they imagined it might have been. So there is something you can play, but it's not quite the same. But one thing to mention about Mire as well is that one of the stampers has recently been posting on their site. So there is a chance he could open up his archive and post something in the future. So we'll just have to wait and see. And then the final one is another personal one that I've been looking for some time, which is Batman Returns. This was featured in all the magazines that I used to buy back in the day. It's previewed quite a lot, lots of screenshots, and they even did a whole diary feature on it as well. Unfortunately, it was too late in the day on the Commodore 64, so Konami decided to drop it. But if you've ever played the Amiga or the ST version, you'll know that it was absolutely atrocious. It was incredibly rushed and buggy. So it might be a godsend not to find this game, but I don't really care too much because I'm still excited to want to play this game, regardless of if it's rubbish. That's part of the thing about the archive. It's not just about finding great games, but just finding anything really that we've been staring at screenshots for so long. Unfortunately, again, the programmer no longer has anything. Ali Noble and John Heap from Denton Designs, they think they may still have something, but it's a case of trying to beg them to go up in their attic and dig out their discs, which I don't think they particularly want to do, but we'll see how things go over time. And then finally, back to Green Lantern. So the preview that we saw earlier that we recovered was actually a later development. There was a bit of development history of Green Lantern, which you can sort of read more about in the book. But originally they started off at Ocean, getting the license and doing like an Amiga and ST version. That got scrapped very early on and kind of got rested. And then a bit later on, they resurrected the idea on the Super Nintendo. And they got a team consisting of Andy Deakin and Ivan Horn to develop it, along with multiple artists, including Ray Coffey and another chap called John Rietzay. And they came up with this really elaborate design where they had different sections where you had platforming elements, you had shoot 'em up elements, and you also had like mode 7 fly into the screen elements as well. And they actually got very close to completion. It was in testing. Then all of a sudden, DC turned around and said, right, we're going to reset the entire universe. Because they'd basically gone down a particular route with the comics, which they felt was a big mistake. They were losing readers. So we thought, we're going to reset everything. And they went to Ocean and said, oh yeah, all this game that you've just finished, we want you to redesign it so it has all of that like reset that we've done. And Ocean kind of went, oh, bugger off. No, we spent ages on this. It's now 1995 and the SNES is dying. The cost of producing cartridges is going to be way too much. So they said, no, we're not going to do that. So they canned it. The developers, Andrew and Ivan, they went on to Other Pastures New. And literally just weeks later, they turned around and Ocean said, actually, let's do it, sod it. And they got another programmer called Bobby Earl, who had just come off Jurassic Park 2 to do his prototype. They decided to stream it back, just make a very simple platformer game, keep as much of the graphics from the original as they could and change the bits they needed to change. But it was a little bit crap, and that was dropped eventually as well, and hence a whole load of time at Ocean wasted for no reason at all. So just because I'm giving this talk, I thought I might as well tell you what my favourite unreleased game is. And this is a game called Spellcast, which was the very first unreleased game I ever played, but I didn't know it at the time. So before I ever got into the whole thing, I used to collect old cover mount tapes from secondhand shops. I used to collect the Zap tapes because I was obsessed with trying to get all the numbers in order and all that kind of thing. And on one of the tapes was a demo of this game, and I keep saying blown away a lot, but I was really blown away by this game because it was like a cross between Castlevania and Ghosts and Goblins, and just absolutely loved it. I was a fan of the NES, and this was like a kind of a NES feely sort of game. It was created by the same people that did CJ's Elephant Antics and also, what's the other game? Spike in Transylvania. And yeah, just fell in love with it. And later on found out that this game was pitched to a number of companies like Codemasters and Ocean Software, and no one picked it up. And if you saw some of the rubbish that had been released back then, it's staggering, and it's a real tragic shame this never got picked up and finished. So what I hope is that someday someone who's really dedicated might sort of reverse engineer it and actually look to finish it off, because I think it's a great little game. And you've got the game already mapped out. The title screen's got this map actually showing you all the different levels in the game. So there's a lot of detail hidden in that preview. So challenges today. So there's a lot of challenges today, unfortunately. This is just one person backing up software, and unfortunately, we just can't save everything. It's going to be impossible, and already we've lost materials and we've lost history. One of the things that we're seeing as well is that the developers that created the games that we grew up with are now sadly passing away, so we're losing people's stories too. So we need as many people as we can trying to work in together to preserve as much history as we possibly can. Overall, we're just one cog in the system. We are part of a collective of different institutions, individuals and groups that are trying to preserve video game history. And we need all of these people too, including the Retro Collective here. Without these places, then so much will be lost to time. And we're in a race against time as well, because the materials and the hardware and the discs, they're all starting to deteriorate. So we need to get these backed up as soon as we can before it's too late. And get the stories from the people too, crucially, because I think that's a massive part of it too. So, I mean, even if you don't run an archive yourself or anything like that, just making simple contributions to any of these people means a huge amount. So if you do get the opportunity to help in any way, then please do. Right, you'll be glad to know I'm pretty much almost done. I just got a final story to sort of leave you with, and it's one of the first times that I met one of my idols, and the very first time that I got to ask someone directly about a game for the website. And it was Rob Hubbard, who many of you remember for his amazing music on the Commodore 64 and other platforms as well. So there's a couple of really old photos back in 2003 at an event called Bit Live. So before Rob was a musician, he was actually a games developer. He did some very early games, educational titles, and he also did a title called Razzmatazz, which was based on a really obscure pop show that was on ITV. Unfortunately, the company he was doing the game for got into a bit of legal trouble, so they made a game called Paranoid Pete, which featured a character that looked quite distinctively like the Weetabix character. And they didn't like that. So they had to kind of reskin this game, but it was too late. They kind of ran out of money quickly because they were quite a new startup company. And as a result, Razzmatazz got cancelled. Now, I first heard about the game thanks to an article in Zap64 called The Musician's Ball, where they got all the musicians together to kind of talk about various projects they've been working on. And everyone was taking the piss out of Rob about this game called Razzmatazz. They were winding him up, and he was basically telling them to f off. So I was a little bit apprehensive about asking him about it, because clearly it was something that pained him. So after first getting my copy of Sanction signed by him, so I made sure I did that first, I plucked up the courage to kind of ask him. I said, Rob, there's a game called Razzmatazz that you worked on. Can you maybe tell me a bit more about it for my website? And he just sort of suddenly stopped what he was doing and stared at me, and in a really broad Newcastle accent just went, "You want to know about Razzmatazz? Well, I'll tell you what, it's crap." And that was the very first quote that I put on the website from the developer. And it's still there today. Thankfully, Rob was a little bit more talkative in later years to Chris Abbott, who works with Rob doing the various sound shows, 64audio.com. He released a book called Master of Magic, and finally got Rob to say a little bit more detail about the game. Unfortunately, it's lost. We have tried various ways of finding it, but we never know. It's one of those things that might just turn up, maybe shoved behind a radiator or something. Who knows? And that's me done.
Thank you again for the fantastic talk you gave us, Frank. Just before you wrap it up, what's next for Games That Weren't?
It's a tricky one. I'm hoping basically the main thing I'm going to be doing is just carrying on as I am. I don't have any real solid plans, just to keep doing what I'm doing and make sure that it's still fun. That's the key thing, because at the end of the day, this is a hobby, and if it's not fun, then I shouldn't really be doing it. But at the moment, I still love it. I still get a buzz from like finding unreleased software and things that we've been searching for a long time. There's nothing like it. So I'm going to carry on doing that as long as possible. I'm additionally doing a second book, and I've been working on that for just over 2 years now. It's been a little bit slow going because I've been sort of caring for my elderly parents, and that's been quite tough. But yeah, I'm just going to try and nail that down, get the book finished as well. And then I keep getting people sending their discs in as well. So I keep getting like suitcases full of discs to preserve. So I think that's going to keep happening, and hopefully we'll just keep preserving as much software as we possibly can. If you've enjoyed the talk today, then please come along and have a look at our site, Games That Weren't. So it's gamesthatweren't.com. We welcome contributions from everyone, really. It's the contributions that really help the site to work and to find things. If it wasn't for the contributors and the team behind it, then the archive wouldn't be half the archive what it is today. So no, thank you everyone.
Thank you for taking the time to watch today. If you love what we do and want to support us, head over to patreon.com/The Retro Collective, just like all the names on the screen have done here, and help us to keep doing what we love so you can enjoy watching it too. Thank you.